by all this drove which I met. And Jacob said, these are to find grace in the sight of my Lord. And Esau says, I have enough, brother. Keep that thou hast unto thyself. And Jacob said, and this is an interesting statement, I think. No, I pray you, if I have now found grace in thy sight, take the present at my hand. For therefore I have seen thy face, as though I had seen the face of God, and thou wast pleased with me. And so he's taking the honorable judgment of his brother, because it is honorable, because Esau did get betrayed. So he has a right to be standing in judgment. And he equates that judgment with what would you say, with the highest of virtues. It's appropriate judgment. And so he wants to make complete amends to Esau, as if Esau is a representative of the divine element of justice. And I guess that's convincing to Esau. It's quite a thing to say, that I need to be reconciled to you because that would simultaneously reconcile me with God. It's crucial. This is between us, but there's a higher principle at stake that's vital. And I think that is the case with betrayal. That's very frequently the case, because if you betray someone, you really you've deeply violated what can only be called a sacred trust. It's the right terminology for that. Take it, I pray thee, my blessing that is brought to thee, because God has dealt graciously with me, and because I have enough. And he urged him, and he took it. So, the story seems to be something like, well, Jacob was kind of an arrogant, crooked, deceitful character, maybe overimpressed with his own ability. He thought it was pretty amusing to pull a fast trick or two on his brother. Then he ran off, which is not all that brave. And then he got walloped a lot and perhaps learned something. And then when he came back, he was a different person. And so that's a reasonable story. And, he has to repent completely about what he did before he can rectify the situation properly. And he's willing to do that. So that's an interesting idea too, because it's an early reflection of the idea that it is, if you do something wrong in the past, A, that you can learn from it, right? So that you're actually capable of learning, and B, that you can set the balance right in the present. And those are very optimistic ideas, because you might say, well, once you've committed some sort of crime, that's it. There's no hope for you. But that's pretty rough, because the probability that you've done unethical things at some point in your life is 100%. And so if there was no way of setting the balance right after that, then everybody would be doomed. So then the story gets rough again. Jacob settles in Shalem. Dinah, his daughter, goes looking around for friends. Shechem, the son of Hamor, lays with her and then wants her for his wife. He actually has the order reversed there. That turns out to be a problem. Jacob hears of this. The fathers talk, and so they make an agreement. The agreement is that if all of Hamor's men, including Hamor and his son, are circumcised, so that's the proper offering, I guess that brings them into the familial fold and indicates that they're willing to make a sacrifice to do so, especially after Shechem put the cart before the horse, let's say. The men of Hamor are circumcised. They agree to do so. That turns out to be a big mistake. So while they're laying around the next day suffering madly from the circumcision, Simeon and Levi come in. They sneak in and kill all of them and take their wealth and their women and children. That's rough. It's rough. Yeah, I guess you guys noticed that, eh? So they're honor societies, right? And there's still lots of honor societies in the world. And so they don't take kindly to what happened to their sister, although they don't kill her. So now it turns out that, it says, as it came to pass on the third day when they were sore, the two of the sons of Jacob, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brethren, took each man his sword and came upon the city boldly and slew all the males. And they slew Hamor and Shechem his son with the edge of the sword, and took Dinah out of Shechem's house, and went out. The sons of Jacob came upon the slain and spoiled the city, because they had defiled their sister. They took the sheep and the oxen and the asses, and that which was in the city, and that which was in the field, and all their wealth, and all their little ones, and their wives took they captive, and spoiled everything else that was in the house. And Jacob actually turns out not to be very happy about that, because he'd met with Hamor, and they'd hammered out a deal, and that's where they were living. And so he figured, well, that he was making the best of a bad lot, let's say, and his sons went behind his back. And Jacob says to Simeon and Levi, "You have troubled me to make me stink among the inhabitants of the land, among the Canaanites and the Perizzites, and I being few in number. They shall gather themselves now together against me and slay me, and I shall be destroyed, I and my house." And they said, "Should he deal with our sister as with a harlot?" And God said unto Jacob, and this is where we get back to the idea of the center. God says to Jacob, "Arise, go to Bethel and dwell there." So Bethel was where Jacob had originally put that pillar, right? So now it's back. So it's a real hero's journey, right? There's the place that he has a set place. He goes out and has these adventures and undergoes a moral transformation, reconciles, and then he comes back to the same place, right, as a transformed person. So that's a full hero cycle. "Arise, go to Bethel and dwell there, and make thou there an altar unto God, that appeared to thee when thou fleddest from the face of Esau thy brother." And Jacob said to his household and to all that were with him, "Put away the strange gods that are among you, and be clean, and change your garments, and let us arise and go up to Bethel. And I will make there an altar unto God, who answered me in the day of my distress, and was with me in the way which I went." And they gave unto Jacob all the strange gods which were in their hand, and all their earrings which were in their ears. And Jacob hid them under the oak which was by Shechem, and they journeyed. And the terror of God was upon the cities that were round about them, and they did not pursue after the sons of Jacob. So Jacob came to Luz, which is in the land of Canaan. That is Bethel, so that's the place where he put up the pillar to begin with. He and all the people that were there with him. And he built there an altar and called the place El Bethel, because there God appeared to him when he fled from the face of his brother. And God appeared to Jacob again when he came out of Paddan Aram and blessed him. And God said unto him, "Thy name is Jacob. Thy name shall not be called any more Jacob," which you remember means usurper, "but Israel shall be thy name, he who wrestles with God." And he called his name Israel. And God said to him, "I am God Almighty, be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall be of thee, and kings shall come out of thy loins. And the land which I gave Abraham and Isaac, to thee I will give it, and to thy seed after thee will I give the land." And God went up from him in the place where he talked with him. And Jacob set up a pillar in the place where he talked with him, a pillar of stone, and he poured a drink offering thereon, and he poured oil thereon. And Jacob called the name of the place where God spake with him, Bethel. So he's returned to the central place which had been given to him as his territory. Rachel dies in labor, in the process giving birth to Benoni, son of my sorrow, whose name was then changed to Benjamin, son of the right hand. Now Reuben, so Simeon and Levi have already done something unforgivable. Now Reuben, it's Reuben's term, he sleeps with Bilhah, who's Jacob, Israel's concubine. So he's the third of the sons to make an unforgivable error, and Jacob/Israel gets wind of it. So Reuben is no longer, he would have been the premier son, given that the two older sons were put out of the running, so to speak, because of their disobedience and impulsive, vengeful cruelty. And then Reuben can't keep his, what do they say? Well, you get the idea. Yeah. Seems to be something that's still quite surprisingly common. So then we have the story that basically ends with the establishment of the 12 tribes of Israel. From Leah, there's Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. From Zilpah, there's Gad and Asher. From Bilhah, there's Dan and Naphtali. And from Rachel, there's Joseph, who figures extraordinarily importantly in the next story that we're going to cover, which hopefully will wrap up Genesis, and Benjamin. And so now Israel itself is established. And so then we turn to, I'm actually going to end this early tonight. That's quite a bloody miracle. So the story then turns to Joseph, and the story begins essentially. Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a coat of many colors. And so what that seems to me to indicate, coats in dreams very often seems to be particularly true of women's dreams. That's been my clinical observation. Clothing and footwear in particular symbolizes a role. And that makes sense, right? Because you dress for the roles. It's not that big a mystery. But so then you might say, well, what does a coat of many colors indicate? And if you think of the multiplicity there, it's something like the mastery of multiple domains, right? Or maybe something like pluripotentiality. And so Jacob is Israel's, or Joseph is Israel's favorite. And because he sees in him this excess possibility. And he basically tells his other sons that Jacob is going to be the head son, which they are not happy with, right? Because he's just this young punk fundamentally. And he's clearly his father's favorite. And he gets this coat that's sort of indicative of this higher status. And so Israel inadvertently sets up a tremendous amount of sibling rivalry in the household again. And that's the understructure of the last story in Genesis. And so in the last of this lecture series for 2017, we'll cover the story of Joseph and his coat of many colors and what happens as a consequence of the favoritism shown to him by his father. And we'll track what happens as a consequence of that. And so I'm going to stop there because I'm finished. So
hello, Dr. Peterson. This is an idea I've been wrestling with for quite some time now. This idea of a lot of the greatest sources of wisdom that we've received throughout human history, either through text, experiences, or scriptures, seems to always come from people going into isolation and then coming back. So I've had a hard time trying to figure out from a scientific point of view or evolutionary point of view, what would compel an organism that is centered around its behavior centered around surviving especially for humans in social groups as well as reproducing, to want to go into isolation, and then not only that, but obtain some level of information that actually helps the group in coming back?
That's a really good question. Okay, so there's this neuropsychologist named L. Conan Goldberg. And Goldberg was a student of Alexander Luria. And Alexander Luria was a Russian neuropsychologist, perhaps the foremost neuropsychologist of the mid to late 20th century. And he had students, Sokolov and Vinogradova, who discovered the orienting reflex, for example. The orienting reflex is the reflex that orients you when something anomalous interferes with your goal-directed behavior. It was a major discovery, like one of the 4 or 5 most important discoveries that have ever been made in psychology, I would say, certainly in neuroscience. So Luria was a big deal. And he was the first person who really established the functional role of the prefrontal cortex as well. So, and he had a very nice overall view of how the brain functioned. His book was written in 1980, and there's still lots in it that's really useful, which is pretty strange for a science that's advanced that quickly. Anyways, so Goldberg came from a great pedigree. I believe Luria's teacher was Pavlov, if I remember correctly. So anyways, Goldberg, you hear some of you may have heard the idea that the left hemisphere is more linguistic than the right hemisphere is. The left hemisphere is specialized for language, and the right hemisphere is specialized for nonverbal imagistic communication. The left hemisphere has a pretty well-organized microstructure, and the right hemisphere is more diffuse as well. And that's true in left-handed males in particular. So the circuitry can be switched around a bit, but it's okay. The modules are basically the same, although they can be moved a little bit. But Goldberg thought that it isn't language versus non-language, it's routine versus novelty. And so the left hemisphere, and there's a neuropsychologist, physician named Ramachandran who's done some very interesting work that's pertinent to this. Maybe I'll tell you a story about him. Anyways, Goldberg believed that the right hemisphere, so you have very old systems underneath both cortical hemispheres that do things like respond to anomaly, to the thing that doesn't fit, to the predator in the distance. Some of that's extraordinarily fast, so that would be like a snake reflex that can move you away from a snake in less time than it takes the snake to bite. And it's really a reflex. It doesn't even hit your brain. It's really super fast. And then there's a defensive crouch that's instantiated higher up in the nervous system, but that's still remarkably fast. And then there's fear as an emotion and the orientation of attention. And then there's the cognitive processing, and that all streams out across a time span, right? And maybe that time span is half a second. And that's really a long time if something is attacking you. So those initial responses are quite primitive, but they're extraordinarily fast. All right, so there's subcortical structures that orient you towards novelty and prepare you for freezing or for attending. And the right hemisphere seems to be dominated by those systems. So imagine that what happens is that something threatens you, you orient towards it, the right hemisphere produces a bunch of images about what it might be. So imagine that's what happens when a child is afraid of the dark. The child's on the bed, they're afraid of the dark, they're crouched because they're frozen like a prey animal, and their right hemisphere is producing monsters to inhabit the darkness that are the child's hypotheses about what might be out there. Okay. Because that's what you want to know, right? You want to know what's out there. And then you want to know what to do about it. I can tell you 2 kids' dreams that are sort of relevant to that. So when my daughter was about 3, she came into the bedroom that my wife and I had, and she was crying. She'd had a nightmare, and she said that she saw a stream, and there was garbage all over the stream, and she didn't like that. And so I sat her down. I said, okay, so imagine the stream with the garbage in it. Now imagine that you're taking the garbage out and throwing it in a garbage bin. And so I got her to like visualize that, because that kind of puts her back in the semi-dream state. And then she cleaned up the mess, and then she could go off to sleep. Now you could tell the child, don't worry about it, the dream isn't real. But that's true, because it's not real like other daytime things are, but it's not like it's not real. It's a dream. Like a dream is real, it's just not the same kind of real. And so what I did with her was to indicate to her practically that if she saw something anomalous, something that was out of place, right, something that was a mess, that it was within her capacity to set it right. Okay, so now your right hemisphere tells you what monsters might inhabit the darkness. Now what you have to do is figure out, there's 2 things you have to figure out. One is what to do about a given monster. And the other is to figure out what to do about the class of all possible monsters. Right. That's a whole different thing. That's something that only human beings are capable of, that level of abstraction. Right. And so what you might do about a particular monster is hide or go out and get rid of it. If it was just an actual animal, right? But that doesn't help, because there's all the other potential predators that are still there. And so maybe you can go hunt all them down, but that doesn't help either, because you can't hunt them all down. It's not very likely anyways. So instead, what you have to do is figure out how to configure yourself so that you're in the best possible position to fight off the monsters when they come. That's your best bet. All right, so now people are trying to figure this out forever. They're trying to figure out what's the answer to the problem of the class of all possible monsters. Part of that's sacrifice. So there are routines, for example, in Hinduism, with the goddess Kali. You make offerings to Kali, who's this devouring goddess. And then she turns into her benevolent counterpart. And so sacrifice is actually one way that you can tame the monsters. If you think about the monster as the set of all negative future potentialities, you make the proper sacrifices, those monsters stay at bay. But then there's heroism as an alternative too, which means the active confrontation of the class of all possible monsters and the building of yourself up into the sort of courageous person that can do that. It took a tremendous amount of meditation to transform those images, say, of the monsters or to solve the problem of the class of those monsters. So now I'll tell you another child's dream. So some of you have probably heard this before, but it's such a great dream that it's worth telling. So I was at my sister-in-law's house once, and her son was running around. He's about 4, very precocious, very verbal, very intelligent, running around with a night hat on and a sword. So he's engaged in this pretty intense play world. And when he goes to sleep, he puts the night hat on his pillow and the sword by his pillow. And at the same time, he's having night terrors. So he's waking up, and it had been for a number of weeks, waking up screaming, but he doesn't know why. There's some things that aren't going so well in the household, and the parents get divorced shortly afterwards. Okay, so that's what's going on underneath, right? And he's also going to go to kindergarten, and so he's about to go into the world. And so he's coping with this, So I'm watching him zoom around as this night and thinking that's pretty cool. And that night he woke up and was screaming. And so we were all at breakfast the next morning. And I said, "Did you dream anything?" And he got really intense. And he said, "Yes, I had a dream." And I said, "Well, what was the dream?" And he said, "Well, I was out on this field, and all these dwarfs came up to me. They were only about as high as my knees, and they didn't have any arms. They had powerful legs, and they were covered with hairy feathers and grease, and there was cross carved in the top of their head, and they had beaks. And whenever he moved anywhere, they would jump at him with their beaks, and there were lots of them. And everyone just said nothing at breakfast. It was yeah. And he was right into this story, eh? And so we were all like, "Yeah, well, that accounts for all the screaming." And and then he said, "Yeah," and then in the background there was a dragon. And every time the dragon puffed out smoke, it would turn into these dwarves. It's like, "Oh man, kid, you really got a problem there. You got beaked things that are biting you, and you can kill them, and that's fine. But then there's the dragon just puffing out new ones." So it's like a hydra problem, right? The old hydra is the serpent. You cut off one head, 7 more grow. It's not a good thing. And it's such a cool dream because it really portrayed this class of all possible monsters problem. So you've got the specific monsters, and that's a problem. So you've got to get rid of them. But that's not the problem. The problem is that there's something in the background that's just generating monsters like mad. And so I said to him, "What do you think you could do about that?" And that's a loaded question, right? That's like leading the witness in a trial. You don't get to ask a question like that because it implies the answer. What could you do about that is not any different than saying you could do something about that, right? So I hinted at that as a possibility, and his eyes lit up. Now you remember, he's already running around as a knight, eh? So he kind of already knew what to do because he had the whole sword and the hat, and with that that you can go after the dragon. He kind of got that. And he said, "I'd get my dad, and then I'd jump up on top of the dragon, and I'd poke out both of its eyes with my sword, and then I'd go right down its throat to the firebox where the fire comes out, and I'd carve out a piece of the firebox, and then I'd use that as a shield." And I thought, yes! Right. Man, It's so smart, because he got the thing instantly. He knew. So imagine, first of all, he thought, okay, I have to go to the heart of the problem, right? And really to the heart, not to the dragon, but right down the damn thing's gullet, right to the place where the fire was actually being created. Because there you could find the shield, and that he'd take this thing that was fireproof and make a shield out of it. And so that was just dead, bloody perfect. It was so cool. And you think, well, how could a kid come up with that? And there's a bunch of answers. I mean, one is, we know snake fear is innate. We know that now. There's been recent research that has demonstrated that. Okay, so, and we've been preyed on and been predators for a very long period of time. So the idea that, and I found something else interesting about the brain out about the brain recently too, in a book I was reading by Ray Kurzweil called How to Build a Mind. I think that's what it was called. It was quite a good book. So I think it was in that book, or it was in a neuroscience paper I was reading. Doesn't matter, but it was in one of those two places. So you know that scanning technology has got more and more high resolution over the last few years, right? It just gets more and more high resolution all the time. And so people are now able to look at the microstructures of the brain in a way that hasn't been possible before. And so the old idea with the cortex basically was that the cortex was full of a bunch of neurons, and then when one neuron and another fired at the same time, they would wire together. And that's kind of how your brain learned to make connections. It's a bit more complicated than that, but that will do. And then it was found that it wasn't quite that simple, because what your cortex is made out of are these columns of neurons that are duplicated, sort of like a centipede's legs. You know, it's very simple genetic code to add another set of legs to a centipede. It's sort of like that with your brain. It's made out of all these columns, and the columns are basically already quite wired up. And then as you learn, the columns wire together. Okay, so there's some pre-existent structure there, but there's more pre-existent structure than that was thought. So it's basically that there are already tracts that link columns together that are in different parts of the brain, and the columns themselves can send out dendrites to these superhighways, which are already there, and then the superhighway is there, and then it can generate connections to the columns at the end of the superhighway. So what that means is that there's a tremendous amount of cortical structure already in place, but there's plasticity around that. And when I read that, I thought, well, that's part of the source of the archetypes. There's already an archetypal structure there, that as well as the subcortical structures. So you could say that, like, the kid already had within him not only the capacity to represent not only the monster, but the class of all possible monsters, and the fact that the problem wasn't monsters, the problem was that monsters could continually be generated, which is a way worse problem. And then the answer to that isn't to kill an individual monster. The answer to that is go to the source of the monstrous itself and defeat it. So it's absolutely staggering, and you can imagine that it would take a tremendous amount of meditative effort for people to have come up with that solution over a very long period of time. So now, the point of the representation is to formulate a picture of what it is that's the threat, so that you can then formulate a general all-purpose solution. And so there's this image of Kali, which I really like, because Kali is sort of the goddess of the darkness, let's say, and destruction. And so Kali is, she has a headdress of fire. Her hair is on fire, and she has a headdress of skulls, and she has hands cut off all around her neck, and she has a belt that's often snakes, but she's sometimes eating the intestines of this guy that she's just given birth to and that she's sitting on. She has 8 legs like a spider, and she's in a web of fire. And so she's a monster in some sense that represents everything that might terrify and devour you. And the question is, so you come up with that representation as an image to represent the class of all terrifying things, and then you have to generate a solution in the face of that class. And sacrifice is one of the solutions. But that heroic encounter is another one of the solutions, and that's the one that he catalyzed. Now, he'd read lots of books. He'd watched lots of Disney movies, you know, and he'd seen the heroic pattern portrayed many, many places. And his little brain was working like mad to extract out the essence of that and to embody it. And when I asked him that question, it just went snap. And all those things lined up, and his night terrors went away. That was it. And I followed up with his mom because it was really quite remarkable, the whole set of occurrences. And he didn't have night terrors that night, even though he'd been having them nightly, and that was the end of them. Because he'd solved his problem. Like he needed to be the courageous knight that went after the dragon. And so that is what people need to be. So I think when we go into solitude, we shut off the external stimulation and we let the dreaming part of our mind emerge. And that's this nonverbal pattern detector that thinks in images. And it's the thing that mediates between what we don't understand and what we do understand. Like, if you understand it completely, you can say it and you can act it out. If you don't understand it, you represent it in images. And it's the emotion, fear, withdrawal, paralysis, and then that manifests itself in an image of what that might be. And that image is the basis for the story, and it's the basis for further development of the idea. And to go into isolation is to let those images emerge and to dream a little bit. And then that moves you ahead into the future.
So to use your language that you used before, it's not enough just to map out the danger that is imminent in front of you, but all the potential dangers that you could come up with in abstract form.
Yeah, well, remember what happens when God throws Adam and Eve out of paradise. They become aware that they're going to die, right? The future becomes a problem. Because you could say the future is the place of all potential monsters, right? And so just the monster that you have right in front of you, it's like, yeah, well, you get rid of that, but that doesn't solve your problem, does it? The problem is, how do you exist in a world full of monsters? And part of that answer is, well, you become a monster yourself. That's a big part of the answer. But it's an incomplete answer, because if you're just a monster, then you're just as bad as the monsters. So you have to be a monstrous enough to contend with the monsters, but then you have to be civilized enough so that you're not a monster yourself. And that's more or less equivalent to the Jungian integration of the shadow. So, yep.
Hi, Dr. Peterson. I've been wanting to ask you this for a while now, since I started watching your lectures. After I started reading Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil, I came upon a paragraph in his chapter on scholars that really bothered me, and it actually bothers me to this day. He talked about this kind of person like they were just a mirror. Like they stretched, he said, every part of their skin basically to allow every new piece of information that they took on, and that all they ever were was just an instrument. They were just a mirror reflecting what they had learned, never actually having generated anything on their own. And it's bothered me, because I feel like in a way it sort of like it's impacted my identity a lot, because I don't know, how are you supposed to create something, so.
Okay, well that's a really good question. I mean, Nietzsche is often classed with the existentialists, right? And so one of the tenets of existentialism, there's two real tenets of existentialism. There's more, but obviously we're oversimplifying. But one is that life is a problem. It isn't because there's something wrong with you. It's that life is a problem. And so that's often contrasted with the Freudian view, which is that if you have a problem, it's because something went wrong during your development. The existentialist said, no, it's like life is a problem, make no mistake about it. And that the purpose of scholarship is in some sense to solve that problem. And so for Nietzsche, like he said, all truths are bloody truths to me. And what he meant by that was that if an idea didn't incarnate itself in you and transform your perceptions and your actions, then you were merely possessed by the idea. You were merely a spokesperson for the idea, or you could say that the idea possessed you. You're a puppet for the idea. It's not you. It's the idea is in you and it has you. You haven't taken the idea and incorporated it with you and made it part of your life. And so there's a romanticism that's associated with that, right? That's the passionate scholar, the person for whom ideas are not merely, what would you call, abstracted representations that can be tossed about as if they're commodities. They're more like personalities. That might be another way of thinking about it. And so, if those ideas are compelling, then you don't. Like one thing I learned a long time ago, and I think this is probably relevant. I know when I was a kid, I liked to argue, and I liked to win arguments or lose them, although I liked winning them a lot better. But I didn't really mind so much what the content of the argument was. I could engage in it like a sparring match, and it was in some sense to establish dominance, right? To establish intellectual dominance. I quit doing that when I was in my mid-20s because I thought that was too shallow an approach to the ideas. They're not commodities of that sort. They have tendrils that reach down into the living. That's the right way to think about it. And so Nietzsche's criticism of scholars, and he did this a lot, was that they were bloodless. They were full of performative contradictions. That's another way of thinking about it. They'd say one thing and do another because their intellect was completely dissociated from their actions. And he thought that was a very bad idea. And I think that's a good criticism. I think it is a bad idea. I also think it makes for an extraordinarily boring lecturer. Because you can tell if you're listening to someone whether the ideas that you're hearing are merely being passed through the person as if they're being memorized, say, or whether they're part of the dynamic core of the person. And if they're part of the dynamic core of the person, then they're almost always engaging and gripping. And so he wasn't a fan of bloodless scholars. And I think that's correct because one of the things that I see, it's not a good idea to have ideas possess you. Unless you know what the ideas are up to. And lots of people are possessed by ideas rather than possessing them. And what that means is they haven't taken the ideas and integrated them into their own being. It's like an incarnation in a sense. They haven't incarnated the ideas in embodied form. And so they're incomplete. Nietzsche also in Thus Spake Zarathustra, when Zarathustra comes down the mountain, he sees a bunch of people gathered around a famous individual, I think maybe a scholar, but it doesn't really matter. And when Zarathustra goes and looks at the person, all he sees is a little tiny midget with a gigantic ear. And so he's a hyper specialist, right? And so he has a pretty impressive ear, but he's only this big. And that was Nietzsche's imagistic commentary on the danger of hyperspecialization and also on the danger of adulation for hyperspecialization. And because he thought about it as a kind of deformity. Now, Nietzsche was a pretty harsh guy, but he did address the issue of the relationship between intellectual knowledge and action, because for Nietzsche, those things are not to be separated in some sense. So, yeah, so maybe, I don't know why maybe it bothered you. Like, it's hard to say why it bothered you. It might have bothered you because it sort of undermined the idea of scholar. But the other possibility, and this isn't an accusation because obviously I don't know anything about you, but it might also be that it struck a chord, and that maybe you were doubtful or questioning how tightly associated your intellectual endeavor was with your actual character and your practice. So that's another possibility. I mean, that's a really good thing to think about because generally speaking, that integration is very much lacking. People are a lot smarter and fluid with their ideas than they are ethical and consistent and characterized by integrity. So, yeah.
Hey, so last week you talked about how you hated people asking you if you believe in God or do you believe in miracles, or you dislike those questions at least. But you also talked about how, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think you said something about the idea of an empirical evidence for religious experiences or spiritual experiences. And I wonder how those two ideas, like, can a spiritual experience exist without God, or how do I had trouble reconciling.
Who knows? I don't know what to make of that. I mean, it depends on what you're willing to accept as proof, I suppose. That's where things get tricky. If you have to demonstrate the existence of God objectively, then subjective experiences of the transcendent are irrelevant, right? But and that's a perfectly reasonable standpoint if your initial presupposition is the only thing that has actual existence is those things that can be demonstrated objectively. And I'm not putting that down. Like, that's a powerful methodology. Our technology is basically dependent on the acceptance, at least the partial acceptance of those axioms. But I also think that it's difficult for me to deny the existence of these patterns of thinking that seem to exist cross-culturally, like the existence of the representation of the dragon, for example, especially given that I can see an evolutionary rationale for the emergence of these representations. So, and then there's also the indisputable fact that religious experiences are accessible to people through a number of different avenues. Now, and one of the things I mentioned when I discussed this before is, well, you could say, well, those are no different than experiences of psychopathology. But they are different because the experiences of psychopathology damage people. Whereas the evidence is that the transcendent experiences actually help people. So unless you're willing to say, well, there are some forms of psychopathological experience that actually facilitate health, which is a possibility, but I think you're pushing your hypothesis at that point.
Would it hurt to define what a religious experience is in this case then? Because I feel like the semantics, like I'm not sure if what you're saying about a religious experience is what I'm understanding.
Well, generally a religious experience is something like an experience of the renewal of the world. That might be one way of thinking about it, so that everything sort of leaps forward as crystalline and perfect, as if you had been viewing it from behind a mask before. Another would be a sense of the union of everything. And so you're a singular being and you're isolated and in religious experiences. So for example, there's a book written recently by a neuroscientist, My Stroke of, what's it called? My Stroke of Insight. Yeah, that's right. And I believe she had a left hemisphere stroke, if I remember correctly. And she was a sufficiently well-developed neuroscientist to understand what was happening as she had the stroke. And she had an intense religious experience as a consequence of that. And she experienced it as a dissolution of the ego into this state of union with everything and this transcendent experience of awe and the well, I don't remember the rest of it. I mean, there are other elements of religious experience that are quite common. The idea of the opening of the heavens, that's one. The communion with the ancestors, that's another. The reduction of the body to a skeleton, that's another. The movement up into heaven. Like these are well-documented phenomena, and a lot of them are associated, well, a fair number of them are associated with psychedelic use, but that's not the only avenue to experiences like that. And epilepsy can produce experiences like that too. And people usually report near-death experiences as well. And, people usually report that those experiences have life-altering significance. Now, that in and of itself only proves that people are capable of having subjective religious experiences, right? It doesn't definitively prove that there's anything outside of that. So Carl Jung, for example, most of the time he didn't talk about God. He talked about the God image, which is not the same thing, because you could have a God image that was even evolutionarily instantiated without that necessarily being related to any transcendent being beyond the image, right? So who knows? Who knows? Again, I think it depends on what you're willing to accept as proof. Now, it's beyond question that people can have life-changing religious experiences. Another example of that is that the best treatment for alcoholism is religious conversion. It's well documented in the literature, and I studied alcoholism for a long time. So one of the cures that sticks is religious conversion. And the 12-step programs essentially attempt to instantiate religious conversion. And it's hard to document their success because they succeed for the people who stick with it. But that's not a very good measure, right? It's sort of self-evident that they work for the people who stick with it. I'm not cynical about Alcoholics Anonymous or anything, but we don't have good data on outcome. But there is good data showing that religious transformation is a good cure for alcoholism. So, and that's an interesting phenomena too. It's too complicated, I probably can't. Okay, I'll try this for a second. So here's how I think a religious conversion might work. So imagine you've got the left hemisphere, and it's the place where your habitual interpretations reside. So I can give you a quick example of this. So this guy Ramachandran, who's a neurophysiologist, or I think that's his field of study. I think he's at UCLA. He studied people who had neglect, and neglect is a very, very bizarre phenomenon. So if you have a stroke that damages your right parietal lobe, you'll lose the left part of your being, not just your body. It's really weird. It's like, so for example, if you have a right parietal stroke and you look at a clock, only half the clock exists for you. It's not like you only see half the clock. It's weirder than that. It's that there's only the right side of the clock. There's only the right side of you. There's only the right side of my body. I don't know that this exists. And so sometimes people with right parietal damage will wake up after the stroke and grab their left arm and throw it out of bed, or their leg and throw it out of bed because it's not theirs. And then, of course, they fall out of bed, which is quite a shock to them. And they'll only eat half the food on the plate. Nobody can really understand this phenomenologically, right? Because we can't imagine what that must be like. I think it must be like, you know how, there's things behind you, but you don't not see them. They're just not there. It's not like it's black or anything, or there's a space. It's just not there. And so I think what happens is the not there extends to 3/4 of the field instead of half the field. That's a guess. Anyway, so now the funny thing about people with neglect is that if you tell them, if you point it out, you say, well, I noticed that you're not moving your left foot today, they'll say, well, it's arthritic and I can't move it. And say, well, why don't you just try to move it? Say, no, look, doctor, I already told you it's in too much pain to move. It was working fine this morning. And that can be months after the accident. So it's a denial. And people thought actually that was trauma-induced denial for a long time before they figured it out was actually a consequence of the neurophysiological damage. Now, Ramachandran found that if you irrigated the contralateral ear, now if you pour cold water in someone's ear, it upsets their vestibular system and their eyes will move back and forth like this. You can try that at a party if you want. And anyways, Ramachandran was testing vestibular function on these patients, and he irrigated the right ear with cold water, and they woke up. And maybe what happened was that was shocking enough. So imagine the networks in the right hemisphere were degraded but not completely gone. And they needed a really high threshold of activation to snap into function. So here's an example of that. If you have Parkinson's disease, imagine you're frozen there, okay? And I throw a ball at you, you'll go like this and catch it. But you can't throw it back. So the stimulus is enough, that's enough to push you past threshold, but you can't do it voluntarily. Now, if you have Parkinson's, like right to the nth degree, you won't even be able to catch it. But there's a stage where you can still do that. There's a great case study where this grandpa was in a wheelchair, he had Parkinson's, and his young grandson was playing out on the dock and fell in the water and started to drown. And he got out of his wheelchair, went into the ocean, rescued him, brought him onto the beach, sat back down in his wheelchair, and was paralyzed again. So that was enough. So you can imagine there was enough network left, so if the emotional tension became high enough that the degraded circuits could still function. So back to Ramachandran. So you irrigate the ear, all of a sudden the right hemisphere connections flash, the remainders manage to connect, and the person goes, oh my God, I've had a terrible stroke. I've lost the left side of my body. They're crying. They're like completely catastrophically overwhelmed by it. And then 20 minutes later, the effects wear off and they snap back in, and now they've lost their left side again. They don't remember it. And so what seems to happen is that the right hemisphere is collecting anomalous information. That's what it does. That's what it does when you're dreaming. It's representing that anomalous information in image form and sort of slowly passing it to the left hemisphere so it doesn't overwhelm it. And maybe if it gets overwhelming, you wake up and you're afraid and you tell someone about the dream. That helps you figure out what it was. But anyways, so that the right hemisphere is always trying to tap the left hemisphere into transformation, right? So now imagine that that can happen a little bit or a lot. So maybe you're just ignoring a little bit of anomalous information. You just have some mildly frightening dreams. Or maybe you've just stacked up a whole bunch of things that you're ignoring and there's some major league monsters that you haven't contended with. Maybe there's situations where the right hemisphere is stored up enough of a counter hypothesis, let's say, about how the world works, making sense out of all those things that you've ignored, that one day it just goes snap, and you're a new personality. And maybe the new personality isn't addicted. So it's something like that, I think. So, yeah. Okay.
Good morning, Citizen Peterson.
How you doing?
I've prepared a real doozy for you here today.
Oh, good.
It's a good thing you've got extra time to handle this one. I'd even say it's rehearsed a little bit, so it's going to be ultra ineffective, you know?
Okay.
Now, I understand that a lecture on the psychological significance of anything, really, is going to indubitably wander off into an anthropocentric worldview. But as a practitioner of the hard sciences, I wanted to dig a little bit deeper, you know? So I sought out, I guess, a religious interpretation of both creative freedom and I guess the very nature of time itself. And I found it, obviously, that's why I'm here. And if you think you have an anthropocentric worldview, it's nothing compared to Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger's, you know? Now, I like to think that, you know, this microphone here, the one that you keep muting out on me, you know, this microphone is an object which exists outside of our individual perceptions. That's just the way I like to look at it. But then I think about the concept, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And certainly, I mean, when you're talking about art, the appreciation of art, there has to be some sort of subjective element integrated into that. But there also must be a limit as well. I mean, certain works of art that we appreciate as absolute masterpieces, like Michelangelo's Pieta, for example, which you bring up frequently because it really is that good. But there's other things which are just, by comparison, they're like vandalism, you know? Now, there's always a temptation, all right, to invoke the principle of a non-overlapping magisteria, but that seems like sort of a cop-out, right? So I formulated, I guess, for myself, 4 standards of measure which help me separate what's the difference between art and mediocrity. And here's the 4. Number 1, education. Number 2, time commitment. You got to put in the time. If you're an artist, it's probably going to become your full-time occupation. It's that you have to be that passionate about it. Number 3, public display. Art isn't something that you own for yourself, you hide it in your basement, then it's not art. It's something which you have to express, you know? Something which you've got to share. And number 4, and I think this is the most important one, efficacy of vision. If you're an artist, you've got to have a vision. And we talk about the dream state here a lot. You go into the dream state, you have inspiration, but it's not enough to just have the inspiration because that's totally subjective for you. The art part about it is having the techniques and the skill and the intent and I guess the capacity to turn that into something real, you know, that you can then express or share. So can you read Cardinal Ratzinger's explanation for the nature of time and then address the concept of beauty in the eye of the beholder with specific reference to the body positivity movement?
How? Jesus. No, I don't think I can. I think that's. I think that you tangled together so many things, and this is also a tangle of things. Not that that's a criticism, that I can't pull them all together with sufficient rapidity not to bore the audience to death. So I'm gonna wait. Okay.
Dr. Peterson, I'm fascinated by the idea of faith, what faith means. Jacob listens to a voice and believes it. He probably heard other voices. Why did he believe this one? There must have been an a priori sort of functional necessity for him to believe the voice that told him one thing or another. And I think that's a string that runs through the Bible and then through the New Testament. We are expected as, well, I confess I'm a Christian. I act like I believe God is real. And so there is this a call of faith, and also in every hero's story we see now, there is always a moment in that story where the hero must believe something beyond the evidence that is before them, which is to say they must take a leap of faith. So I'm wondering if you could just kind of unpack that experience of faith and the understanding of how a human being makes the choice to believe one thing or another.
God, that's a great question. I mean, is this still on? Is this still working? Okay, good. I don't precisely know the answer to that. It's a very peculiar thing because we think many things, or you could say many voices appear in our minds. Because when Nietzsche took Descartes' "I think, therefore I am" apart, and he said, well, it isn't so obvious that there's an I, first of all, that it's a unity, like a unity transparent unto itself, which of course the psychoanalysts picked up in a big way. And then he wasn't sure that it was the I who thought in some causal manner. He said, well, no, it's more like thoughts, it's something like thoughts appear in the phenomenal field, and maybe you choose between them, or maybe they possess you. Like there's lots of other ways of thinking about it. It isn't exactly obvious to me why we choose to take one pathway rather than another, when so many of them offer themselves to us. You know, people tend to talk about that as something like conscience, right? And now maybe it's that it's got to have something to do, I think. It's an endless regress, because you can always ask why any assumption became primary. But I'll put that aside for a moment. It seems to me to have something to do with your aims. You know, that you're more likely to listen to a voice that is in keeping with your most fundamental aims. And then the question is, where do your most fundamental aims come from? And from what I've been able to determine, and I'll speak psychologically again, is that to begin with, you're a concatenation of rather primitive subpersonalities. Hungry ones, tired ones, upset ones, laughing ones. You can see that in babies. You know, they cycle through those states very rapidly. There's a infantile unity above all that, but it doesn't have control, right? And so then the developing individual has to figure out how to integrate those primitive subpersonalities into a unified personality. At the same time, they integrate the unified personality into a social unity. So it's partly individual integration, but it's fed by social forces. I mean, even when you watch an infant breastfeed, it's established a relationship with its mother, and there's a reciprocity that's already at play there. So then that underlying multiplicity starts to form itself into a unity. And then the question, and I would say that's something like the emergence of the individual out of the Titans. That's a reasonable way of thinking about it. Like a sovereign out of the Titans. It's something like that. But then there's another division which seems to me to parallel the Cain and Abel division. It's that integration can be oriented towards something that's positive, but it can also be oriented towards something that's negative. And that's the split of the world into good and evil, I think. And then it looks like you're navigating between those. And I can only account for that with something like choice. Like, I think the free choice, even though I don't understand it, I'm unwilling to deny the existence of free choice merely because I don't understand it. Because it looks to me like that's how people act, that's how they expect to be treated, and that societies that structure themselves in accordance with the idea that people have free choice actually work. Now, that doesn't prove that there's free choice, but people have been arguing about that forever. But it looks to me, so those are two possible means of integration, and then I think what you're doing is feeding one or the other constantly. And I think you probably choose which one to feed. I think. That's how it feels that way to me as well. Like when I look at my own, maybe you're really aggravated with something. Maybe you're aggravated with your wife, or your child or something like that, and you're feeling kind of nasty, and maybe you even know that you're in the wrong. And an idea comes into your head. You think, I could say that. And you could say it, and you know what it would do. But then you pause and you think, would that make it better or worse? And then maybe you go to hell with it, which is quite the thing to say. I've got a little story about that in a minute. And then you say it, but you knew that you took the low road, right? And you know it. And then you're guilty about that and defensive, and that makes the fight way worse, because then there's no damn way you're going to admit that you actually did that. And so things do go to hell. And so here's an ugly little idea. So that's relevant to the question. So imagine you're playing around with cocaine. Now, I'm using cocaine because it's very addictive, but it's a very interesting chemical because it's a dopaminergic agonist. And what dopamine does is two things. It makes you feel like what you're doing is worthwhile, but it also, imagine that there's a bunch of neural circuits that are active and then they get a hit of dopamine, or you do. Then those neural circuits get a little bit more powerful. Okay, so it has a rewarding property, which is that it makes you feel like what you're doing is important. And it has a reinforcing property, which is it makes neural circuits grow. So now what that means is that whatever you were doing just before you took cocaine grows. Okay, so now imagine there's a bunch of different things that you do just before you take cocaine, but there's a string of decisions, and at one decision point is the same for all of those different occurrences. And that decision point is, because you know you're in trouble, and that decision point is, well, to hell with it. Okay, so then you think that each of the 200 times that you take cocaine, even though you do it in different places, but that one thought is there all the time, and that thing grows because you're reinforcing it, and it grows and it grows and it grows. And so now that's in you, that's part of you, and it's the thing that says to hell with it. Okay, so now, and maybe that's not such a good thing to grow inside your brain. So then you're addicted, and they take you to a cocaine treatment center, and after a week you're no longer physiologically addicted. You're not craving, you don't have a problem, as long as you're there. But then they take you back to your normal environment, and you see, like, Cocaine Joe, your friend, and as soon as you see him, up that thing comes, and bang, you're back on the to hell with it track. And that's where you will end up too, if you reinforce that particular perspective long enough. So that's akin, in a sense, to this decision-making process. If you take the low road, then that wins, and it gets a little stronger. Because everything that wins neurologically gets a little stronger. It's like a Darwinian competition. So one rule is don't practice what you don't want to become, because you really do become that. It builds itself right into your neural architecture. And that's one of the terrifying things about addiction, because you think, well, it's kind of psychological. It's like, yeah, kind of. It's also kind of neurophysiological, and you build a one-eyed cocaine monster in your head if you hit yourself enough with something that reinforcing. So, yeah. Last question, I guess.
Hallelujah. Just a really simple question then
I'm not sure how
about
to take that.
long suffering.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I was noticing from the stories of Jacob and a lot of these biblical narratives is you do have this all-powerful God who's able to kind of essentially be the hidden protagonist in the narrative. But then the funny thing is that he's kind of revealing some of his qualities throughout the course of the story. So you were talking about the weird paradox of the fact that God somehow allows Jacob, Israel, to win the fight.
Yeah, and he does that with Abraham too, right?
Yeah. So my question is relating to Pansep's thing about the rats that you told like 3 or 4 times on a number of occasions. I saw one of your more recent videos, you talked about it, where the bigger rat lets the smaller rat win because then the smaller rat won't engage in the game. So the question is twofold for me. One is God allowing humanity to win periodically so that's to allow us to actually engage in the dialogue through these stories. And 2, is it a much more primitive version of the virtue of humility, which you wouldn't normally characterize of an omnipotent deity?
Well, those are excellent questions. I really like the second one in particular, that God's decision to allow human victory from time to time is actually a manifestation of something approximating humility, or at least mercy. But humility is an interesting take on it.
Well, it's also connected to Paul's image of how Christ hands himself over and allows himself to be defeated by men and therefore conquers sin, which is man's enemy. It's the same paradox where God enters into that dynamic with people
And loses to win.
and willingly loses.
Yeah, well, okay, so the first thing I would say is that's a really interesting analogy. I can't, it's a complicated enough question so that I can't go beyond, I don't think I can go beyond the question actually, because it's so complicated that I don't think I can formulate it any better than you already did. Like, it's an interesting string of ideas. I'd have to play with it a while to see. It does shed an interesting light on why God is amenable to negotiation in the Old Testament, which is really a strange, as you pointed out, it's really a strange thing. It's like, this is omnipotent God who obviously can do whatever he wants, and yet he can be bargained with. And that also opens up the question of why. Like, your hypothesis is, well, if you don't let the little rat win now and then they get dejected and quit playing. And that's a pretty good observation. If people don't get to win now and then, that's kind of what happens to Cain. God says, well, you're not playing a straight game, that's why you're not winning. But there's an intimation in the Old Testament, and I think it's more developed in the New Testament, maybe not, that the straighter the game you play, the more likely you are to win. And so maybe part of the reason that God lets Abraham bargain and even Jacob is because they've started to play very straight games. And so maybe you do win in your wrestling with God if you play a straight game. I think the reason that's true is because that's actually why we would define it as a straight game. Now, then we could speak psychologically again. I think that what we've come to recognize as a straight game is the game that in the broadest number of situations across the widest range of time spans is most likely to produce a positive outcome. And that's actually the grounds for our sense of ethics, that it's really practical.
Not to belabor it too much, because there was an interesting insight from Chesterton's The Man Who Was Thursday, where God sets himself up as the benevolent antagonist so as to accelerate the game.
Yeah, well, I think that's a really interesting idea. There is hints, I would say, throughout the biblical stories that the reason that God tolerates Satan, let's say, is because without an adversary, you're soft. And that's tied in with the notion that life is something like a moral struggle. That's the fundamental essence of being, a moral struggle. Now, I think that's phenomenologically a reasonable observation. Maybe other people don't experience it that way, but it seems to me, like within my own experience, that that's accurate. Now, I don't know what that says about the fundamental nature of reality. But I had a vision at one point that I was in a ring with Satan, actually, believe it or not. And it was like a Roman Colosseum. And, I was rather upset to find myself there, but I won. And I asked God afterwards why he would do such a thing, and his answer was he knew I could win. That's interesting, because, I don't know what to make of that. Believe me, I have no idea what to make of that. But the idea was that if you're trying to encourage someone rather than protect them, because those are really different things, right? To protect someone isn't to make them strong. To encourage them is to make them strong. Then you set them a series of challenges right at the point where they may win. And maybe you could make a case that that's what you do if you really care for someone. Now, I know that I'm not saying that interpretation is correct. I'm not, but there's something, you definitely with your children, when you're wrestling with them, say, when you're playing with them, you push them to the limit of their ability. Because otherwise they don't transcend their current abilities. Yep.
If you found this conversation meaningful, you might think about picking up Dad's books, Maps of Meaning, The Architecture of Belief, or his newer bestseller, 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos. Both of these works delve much deeper into the topics covered in the Jordan B. Peterson podcast. See jordanbpeterson.com for audio, ebook, and text links, or pick up the books at your favorite bookseller. Remember to check out jordanbpeterson.com/personality for information on his new course, which is now 50% off. I hope you enjoyed this podcast. If you did, please let a friend know or leave a review. Next week's episode is a continuation of the biblical series and is titled Joseph and the Coat of Many Colors. Talk to you next week.
Follow me on my YouTube channel, Jordan B. Peterson, on Twitter @Jordan B. Peterson, on Facebook @Dr. Jordan B. Peterson, and at Instagram @Jordan.B.Peterson. Details on this show, access to my blog, information about my tour dates and other events, and my list of recommended books can be found on my website, jordanbpeterson.com.